The rooster hadn't even crowed when the whispers started. Word traveled fast in the village, faster than fire on dry grass. A wedding was happening today, but no one was celebrating. There was no joy in the air, only murmurs and pity. She sat on the wooden stool near the window, staring out at the dirt road, eyes hollow. The sun peeked over the hills, golden light stretching across the tired fields and broken fences. But nothing in her life looked golden anymore. Her hands rested stiffly in her lap, calloused from years of labor, trembling despite her effort to stay composed. This wasn't how she imagined her wedding day, not in the faded dress borrowed from an aunt. Not with neighbors peeking in to confirm the rumors. She was marrying a man she had never truly met, a stranger, a nobody. He was poor, they said. Poorer than her family, if that was even possible. A man with no past, no land, no livestock, just a quiet presence and a shadow that loomed longer than the man himself. She hadn't chosen this. The decision had been made over a hushed conversation late one night, when her father returned home drunk and desperate. Debts were due. Creditors were circling. Her worth had been calculated like grain in a sack, measured, bartered, given away. When the man arrived that morning, he came alone. No family, no procession, no smile. Dust clung to his boots, and the collar of his shirt was frayed. But his eyes, those eyes didn't belong to a beggar. They were sharp, observant, quietly dangerous, as if they saw everything and gave nothing away. The village gathered, pretending to be curious rather than cruel. Some laughed behind their hands. Others shook their heads, calling it a waste of youth and beauty. No one saw the silent scream trapped inside her chest. The ceremony was rushed. A few muttered blessings, an old official yawning through the vows. They stood side by side, inches apart but worlds away. He didn't touch her, didn't even glance her way. And maybe that was the worst part, feeling invisible at her own wedding. When it was over, there was no feast, no music, just silence and the smell of dry earth. She didn't cry. Not when her mother turned away to hide her guilt. Not when her father told her to make the best of it. Not even when the man her husband gestured for her to follow. They walked for what felt like hours, through cracked paths and whispering trees. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't care. Everything inside her felt numb, except for a growing ache that she was being led to a life even harder than the one she had left. When they arrived, it was a small hut, hidden at the forest's edge. Quiet, lonely, but oddly clean. She stepped inside cautiously. There was a single bed, a water pot, and a window facing the wild woods. He said nothing, just set her bundle down near the bed and retreated to the far corner of the room, sitting like a man used to walls and silence. She stood in the doorway, still unsure if this was real, if she was now truly married to someone who hadn't even offered her a single word. That night, they slept with a wall of silence between them. But while she closed her eyes and let the tears fall soundlessly, he stared into the dark, his heart clenched not with fear, but restraint, because he wasn't who he seemed. And tomorrow, everything would begin to shift. The next morning came with a thick fog, as if the sky itself couldn't bear to witness what lay ahead. She woke up before the first bird dared to sing, curled on the far edge of the bed, blanket clutched to her chest like a shield. Her eyes opened, but she didn't move, not yet. The weight of reality hadn't fully settled, not until she heard the rustle of clothes and the scrape of a chair. He was already up, sitting by the small wooden table, head down, focused on something. She couldn't see what. He hadn't noticed she was awake, or maybe he had, but didn't care to say so. That was his way, silent, distant, unreadable, like a closed book with pages too tightly bound. She rose slowly, legs stiff. The floor was cold beneath her feet, a reminder that this wasn't a dream. This was her life now. No more crowded meals with her siblings. No more familiar laughter echoing through thin walls. Just a quiet shack, a stranger, and a marriage signed by necessity, not love. He looked up then, eyes brushing over her like a passing breeze, cool and indifferent. No good morning. No smile. Just a nod, the kind given to a passing acquaintance. Her chest tightened, not with anger, but with something worse. Emptiness. He pushed a bowl toward her. Porridge. Plain, but hot. She accepted it without a word, hands wrapped around the warmth like it could thaw the cold growing inside her. They ate in silence. Outside, the village moved on. Chickens clucked. Children ran barefoot through dusty alleys. Somewhere, someone was laughing, but none of it reached the little hut tucked away behind the trees. Later, he left. No explanation, no promise to return, just the sound of footsteps fading into the woods. She watched him go, arms folded tight, unsure if she felt relief or fear. All afternoon, she sat by the door, waiting. Not because she missed him, how could she, but because waiting gave her something to do, something to hope for. Hours passed. The sun drifted across the sky, shadows stretching like claws on the floor. Still, no sign of him. Doubt began to whisper. Had he abandoned her? Was this all a cruel trick? Had her family sold her off like cattle, only for the buyer to disappear the next day? But just as panic threatened to rise, he returned. His shirt was damp with sweat, arms scratched by thorns. In his hands, a bundle of wild vegetables, a few pieces of firewood, and strangely an apple, not the kind from their withered trees. This one was round, polished, too perfect to belong here. She didn't ask where he got it. He placed the apple silently on the table, his eyes briefly flickering toward her before he turned away again. It was the briefest moment. A flicker. But something shifted in that gaze. Not warmth, not affection, but something softer than indifference. She stared at the apple long after he went to the back of the hut. Something about it unsettled her. Something about him didn't fit. Later that night, long after the lantern had been blown out and the forest whispered secrets outside their window, she lay awake again watching him from across the room. He wasn't sleeping. He was staring out the window, his back to her, shoulders tense, like a man carrying a burden no one could see. And for the first time, she wondered if he was hiding something. Something more than just a broken past. Something much bigger. Rain fell hard the next morning, drumming on the tin roof like an urgent warning. The air was thick with the scent of wet soil and wood smoke, and the little hut felt even smaller, as if the storm had wrapped its fists around the walls and refused to let go. She sat at the window, knees pulled to her chest, watching water stream down the glass in crooked lines. It had been 3 days since the wedding. 3 days of silence, awkward meals, and moments that felt like they belonged to two strangers, forced to play house. But something had changed last night. That apple, the way it gleamed on the table, untouched. The way his eyes had lingered on it when he thought she wasn't watching. And today he was acting different. He wasn't gone like usual. Instead, he moved around the hut with uncharacteristic focus, checking the roof for leaks, reinforcing the door with a beam of wood he seemed to have carved by hand. He didn't speak, not even once, but his presence was more than a shadow now. It had weight. When the firewood started to sputter, she went to rekindle it. But the macas were gone. She rummaged through the small box of nothing. Just as frustration began to rise, he appeared behind her. Without a word, he knelt, pulled a small silver lighter from his pocket, and with a flick the fire sparked to life. She blinked. A lighter, but not the kind villagers used. Not the clunky plastic kind. This one was sleek, engraved with letters too faint to read. It didn't belong here. It was too polished, too refined, just like the apple. He noticed her staring. For the first time, he spoke. "Don't ask where it came from," he said, voice low but firm. Not cold, but not warm either. And that was all. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mouth had gone dry, and her mind was already racing. He had secrets, she was sure now. Things he didn't want her to see. Things he hadn't meant to let slip. That night, she couldn't sleep. The wind howled through the trees, but inside the hut, it was deathly quiet. She rolled onto her side, facing his silhouette across the room. The fire had died out, and moonlight pooled through the window like liquid silver. He was still awake. She could tell by the rise and fall of his breath, by the stillness in his frame. Like he was waiting, listening. For what? A knock, a voice, a memory? She didn't know. But she knew one thing, now he wasn't just poor. No truly poor man owned a silver lighter that gleamed like an heirloom. No poor man found perfect apples in the middle of a barren forest. And no poor man stared out into the night like he was mourning a world no one here had ever seen. Whatever he was hiding, it was big, and sooner or later, it would come knocking. The rain had stopped by dawn, but the village roads remained thick with mud. Smoke curled lazily from rooftops, and the usual chatter of early risers hummed in the background. Life went on, but not inside the little hut at the edge of the forest. Inside, tension sat between them like a third presence. She prepared breakfast quietly, avoiding his eyes. He sat across from her, arms crossed, as if guarding a wall that only grew taller each day. The lighter hadn't reappeared. The apple still sat on the table, untouched. But the silence didn't last. A knock came, sharp, confident, out of place. They both froze. No one ever came this far from the village unless they were lost or had a reason. She turned toward the door slowly, heart hammering. But he was already on his feet, stepping forward with a stillness too precise to be natural. He opened the door only halfway, and there, standing in the mist, was a man that did not belong in their world. His boots were polished, his coat tailored. He stood tall and impatient, holding an envelope in gloved hands. Behind him, a sleek black car sat half concealed by Treeset's glossy surface, gleaming like a piece of another universe. She stared, stunned. The visitor gave a tight nod. "We've been trying to reach you." Not a greeting, a statement. Her husband's reply was colder than the rain. "I told you not to come here." The word sliced through the quiet like a knife. "I wouldn't have," the man said, lifting the envelope, but this couldn't wait. There was tension, thick, knotted, and old. The visitor didn't glance at her, but she felt his curiosity prickling under the surface. A beat passed. Then, without another word, her husband took the envelope, stepped back, and shut the door. She stood there, breath caught in her throat. He didn't look at her. Not right away. He walked to the table, placed the envelope down carefully, and stared at it like it might explode. She spoke, finally. "Who was that?" No answer. She tried again. "Why did he come here?" Still nothing. Just the sound of his breathing, slightly too sharp, too controlled. Then, without looking at her, he whispered, "Forget you saw him." But how could she? The envelope, the car, the man in the tailored coat, it all screamed of another life. A life he had buried. A life he didn't want her to know about. That night, he didn't sleep, and neither did she, because the truth had cracked its way into their world. And the mask he wore was starting to slip. The envelope sat untouched on the table for 2 days. He didn't open it. Not when she left the room. Not when she lingered nearby. It was as if he was daring it to disappear. But paper doesn't vanish on its own. and secrets don't stay buried forever. She tried to pretend she didn't notice this intruder made of parchment and silence, but its presence was louder than any words between them. He barely spoke. He worked outside longer than usual, chopping wood until his knuckles turned raw. She watched from the doorway, unsure what burned hotter her, curiosity or the growing sense that the man she married wasn't the man she thought. On the third night, she couldn't take it anymore. When he was gone to fetch water, she walked to the table, hand trembling as she reached for the envelope. Her fingers brushed the edge-thick paper, sealed in red wax. There was no name written on the front. But before she could pull it closer, the door creaked. He stood there, soaked from rain again, his eyes dark not with anger, but something deeper. Something wounded. "Don't," he said. She pulled her hand back like it had been burned. "I wasn't going to," she began, but the lie didn't finish itself. He stepped forward and picked up the envelope. His gaze never left hers. Then, finally, he opened it. She watched every movement, the way his hands hesitated, the way his jaw clenched as he unfolded the contents. A single letter, a signature at the bottom, and a thin, black card that slipped out and landed on the table with a quiet, deadly weight. She didn't understand what she was seeing, but she knew it mattered. His hands trembled for the first time since she had met him. And then he sighed. Not the sigh of a poor man. Not the sigh of someone beaten by life. But the sigh of someone with too much to carry and nowhere left to run. "They found me," he said quietly. She frowned. He looked up at her then. Really looked. And in that moment, she saw it. The roughness he wore like armor wasn't natural. The silence wasn't just shyness. The poverty wasn't the whole truth. "They're not supposed to know where I am," he said. "I left that world. I gave it all up. But they don't care." She stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "What world?" He hesitated. And then, for the first time, he told her a piece of the truth. "I'm not who you think I am." It wasn't much. Just a few words. But in those words, her world began to tilt. Because now she knew, the man she had been forced to marry was living under a mask. And the life they were building, quiet, rough, and simple, was a disguise for something much more dangerous. And maybe, much more powerful. The morning after the envelope was opened, the village seemed to carry on, as usual, vendors shouting prices, dogs barking, hens darting through alleyways, but inside the small hut, time felt frozen. She watched him from across the room as he packed a small bag. Quiet, methodical, each movement rehearsed, like he had left in a hurry many times. "Where are you going?" she finally asked, her voice brittle. He didn't look up. "Just for a day. Maybe two. I have to settle something." She moved to block the door, heart pounding. "You're not running, are you?" He paused, then lifted his eyes, steady, unreadable, but not cold. "If I wanted to run, I wouldn't have opened the envelope in front of you." That silenced her. He stepped closer, gently shifting her aside. Not with force. With trust. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. There were so many questions clawing at her throat. What was he hiding? Who was he? And why did a man with nothing to his name carry himself like he could buy the entire village and burn it down in the same breath? But none of those words came out. Instead, she asked the one question that mattered most in that moment. "Will you come back?" He stopped at the threshold, turned, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of emotion in his eyes. Not guilt, not sorrow, but something gentler, something that felt dangerously close to fear. "I will. But when I do, you might not look at me the same way again." Then he was gone. She stood at the doorway long after his silhouette vanished down the dirt road. The trees swallowed him. The wind followed in his wake, and she was left alone with a head full of questions and a heart she hadn't realized was beginning to open. The day dragged. She cleaned just to stay busy. The apple on the table was still there, untouched. She picked it up, studying its flawless skin. No wormholes, no bruise. The kind of fruit that didn't come from these lands. A strange chill swept through her. She turned it over. There at the very bottom something small was burned into the skin. A faint crest, etched so delicately it was almost invisible unless you were looking for it. A family crest. That apple hadn't just come from another town. It had come from another world. And she was now entangled in it. By the third day of his absence, the village began to whisper. She heard it first in the market, hushed voices behind woven baskets and sacks of grain. They say he wasn't born here. I always thought there was something off about him. Maybe he's on the run. She kept her head down, but every word sank deep. The people who had ignored him before now seemed interested, too interested. As if his mystery had suddenly become everyone's entertainment. At home, the silence was heavier than ever. She sat at the table, turning the apple over in her hands, again and again, tracing the faint crest carved into its skin. She didn't recognize the symbol, but the way it was burned with precision, almost like it had been branded, told her it wasn't a mistake. That crest belonged somewhere, to someone, and whoever that was, they had found him. That evening, a stranger came to the door. Not like the last one. This one was older, dressed in dusty robes, leaning on a crooked cane. His eyes were pale, but they missed nothing. He didn't knock. He simply appeared in the doorway like he had walked through the storm of secrets to get here. "You're the girl," he said. Not a question, a fact. She stepped back instinctively. "I knew his father," the old man continued, stepping inside uninvited. "Long before he wore those rags. Long before he ran from who he was." Her heart thudded. "You know him?" "I know of him. Everyone in the capital does. Or did." Before he vanished, she clenched her fists. "Who is he?" The old man smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only pity. "You married a ghost girl. A man who was born into gold but chose to sleep in the dirt. He turned his back on an empire." The words knocked the wind from her lungs. "Why?" she whispered. The old man tilted his head. "That's for him to say. If he ever finds the courage. But make no mistake, those looking for him won't stop until he is dragged back into that gilded prison." She swallowed hard. What do they want? His name? His wealth? His silence? It depends on who gets to him first. He reached into his coat and pulled something out. A photograph. A young man in a sharp suit, eyes defiant even as a crowd of cameras flashed around him. It was him, clean-shaven, dressed like royalty, smiling, but only with his mouth. His eyes, they were the same. Haunted, the old man placed the photo on the table beside the apple. "Ask yourself," he said, voice low, "when he comes back, will you still want the man behind the mask?" And then he left just as quietly as he came. She sat there long after, staring at the photograph and the branded apple. The two pieces of him she never knew existed. A prince living like a peasant, and she guessed a poor girl from a forgotten village had unknowingly stepped into the middle of a storm. But something deep inside her whispered. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Night fell quietly, but her heartbeat thundered like drums. She hadn't slept in 2 nights. Not since the old man's warning. Not since the photograph shattered everything she thought she knew. She stared at the door, hoping, fearing. Then just past midnight, a soft creak. The latch turned, and he stepped inside. Rain clung to him like secrets, soaking his clothes, dripping from his hair. He looked different, but not because of anything visible. There was something heavier on him now, as if the burden he carried had doubled, and he was just barely holding it together. Their eyes met. She wanted to run to him, to scream, to cry, but instead, she stood frozen, breath caught somewhere between anger and relief. "You came back," she said, barely above a whisper. He nodded, silent. But he didn't step forward. She looked him over. No injuries, no bags, just a distant look in his eyes, like he'd seen something that couldn't be unseen. "I know," she blurted before she could stop herself. "I know you're not who you said you were, or rather, who you pretended to be." A long silence. Then, finally, he took a step inside, shutting the door behind him. "I never meant to lie," he said. "I just wanted to be forgotten." She crossed her arms. "By whom?" "Everyone." He moved toward the table and saw the photograph. The apple. The old man's shadow still lingered in the air like smoke. "You met him," he murmured, almost to himself. "He said you left an empire behind," she said carefully. "Is it true?" He sat down slowly, shoulders slumped. "What I left behind wasn't an empire. It was a cage, a life built on power, politics, and puppets in expensive suits." "And you were one of them," she said. He nodded. "Until I wasn't." Silence fell again, heavy with all the unsaid. She sat across from him. "Why me?" His eyes flicked to hers, raw and exposed for the first time. "Because you didn't know who I was. You didn't care about status or money. You looked at me and saw a man, just a man." She swallowed hard. "And now that I do know." He didn't answer. Not with words. Just looked down at the table. "I was forced to marry you," she said, her voice trembling. "And I hated it. But you were kind, quiet, gentle. Even in your silence, you never made me feel less." She paused, her voice cracking. "I didn't fall in love with a billionaire. I fell in love with the man who chopped wood in the rain. The man who didn't raise his voice even when I slammed doors. The man who sat beside me in the dark and said nothing but made me feel safe." Tears prickled her eyes. She stood abruptly. "I don't care how rich you are. I care if you're going to run again." He rose too. "I'm done running." And in that moment, no money, no name, no photograph could come between them. But neither of them knew far beyond the village. Others were closing in. Powerful men with sharper claws. Men who would not let their golden ghosts disappear so easily. The storm was just beginning, and this time, love alone might not be enough. The sun rose, casting pale light over the village. But inside the small hut, the weight of the night lingered like a thick fog. He had stayed awake most of the night, staring out the window. Wrestling with ghosts she couldn't see but could feel whispers of a life buried beneath dust and lies. She sat beside him in silence, the fragile thread between them stretched tight but unbroken. Suddenly, a sharp knock shattered the quiet. Not the soft, hesitant knocks of a visitor seeking shelter. This was deliberate. Urgent. She looked at him, heart pounding. He didn't move. The knock came again, faster this time. He stood, muscles taut, eyes scanning. At the door stood two men dressed in suits that gleamed even under the dim morning light, faces unreadable, eyes cold and calculating. "We're here for him," one said, voice low but firm. She stepped forward, protective. "He's just a poor man from this village," she said firmly. One man smiled thinly. He's a man who owes many favors, many debts. It's time to settle. Fear surged through her, but so did something else. Defiance. He turned to her, voice steady. Stay inside. Don't open the door. The men spoke again, louder. We know you're in there. Let us in, and this can end peacefully. Her fists clenched. He moved between her and the door. I won't let them take you. The men exchanged a glance. This isn't about her, the other man said coldly. It's about the man who left a fortune behind, then the secrets that fortune hides. She looked at him. The man she thought she knew, the man chopping wood and hiding in the mud, was gone. In his place stood someone else. A man who had fought too hard to disappear. A man who now faced the past he had tried to bury.